Well, thank you everyone for joining us out there. Welcome to Quick to Politic, the political talk show that, we talk about Michigan political issues and, economics, the economy, history, and it runs the gamut, and we have a myriad of different guests on our show. So today we are joined by Brandon Brice, the leading voice in Black conservative issues and the host of Straight Talk on AM 910. Brandon has stayed true to his commitment to service by, he's earned his bachelor's and his MBA master's in science from Rutgers University, and then also a business administration degree from Howard University. And you have served also with the United Nations Foundation and the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And then you also began your career as a staffer on Capitol Hill and with the office of former U.S. Speaker J. Dennis Haysbert. So tell us a little bit more about yourself. You've been in Washington, D.C., you have been in Atlanta, and you currently run the Boy Scouts of America. You were a Michigan Political Leadership Fellow, and then you're also a Black conservative. So I've been wanting to talk to you about, just some of those issues. And so just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm originally from Southwest Detroit. Went to Brother Rice, and I quickly became interested in the issue around education reform because I am from the streets, but I always laugh and joke. I say I went from the streets to the suites. And so literally, I went to Brother Rice High School, got a top education, then I went to Howard. And it wasn't, believe it or not, until I went to a Black college that I became a conservative, i.e. a Republican or whatever you want to call it. Funny story, I tried to get a job on Capitol Hill. And at the time, couldn't find a job with any of the Democrats. And so it was a Republican, Max Burns out of Georgia, they introduced me to Dennis Hastert, then who was the Speaker of the House, who gave me my first job in Washington. And so it was more out of opportunity that I learned to play in both worlds, being a Black man in America, going to a liberal school like Howard, but also being a Republican and trying to create a new wave of solutions for Black issues. And so part of what I've tried to do is create a voice and create a movement that says not all Black people think alike. Our issues are not monolithic. And I think diversity of ideas is what makes us great, not groupthink. Unfortunately, in our communities, I think we see a lot of, everybody's going with this way and that's the way I'm going to vote. And I've always been a supporter to say it's okay to be different. And I think that has kind of been my mission in life. And that has kind of been my mission when it comes to promoting things like prison reform, education reform, and things of those nature.
Exactly. And, speaking of, just being someone who's kind of like on the cusp and thinking one way and, just leaning more fiscally conservative, but at the same time existing in a world that is a little bit more liberal in nature, how do you find the balance, and how do you kind of bridge the other side when there are issues like the recent, 2 men were recently convicted, 2 white men who killed an unarmed Black man while he was jogging. And so what is your take on why these killings of unarmed Black people, they keep happening? And what is it that, on one side of the argument that can bridge the other side and kind of like prevent this sort of thing from continuing to happen?
So I always say there's 2 types of Black conservatives. The ones that profit from books and TV shows and, the shock wave media type of Black Republican. And then the one that's actually focused on Black issues. And so I thought when it came to Aubrey's case, that was an opportunity for Black.
I lost your audio for a moment there.
Got you. That was an opportunity for Black Republicans to really stand up and say, you know, this is clearly a breach of our judicial system. I watched the video. The kid was literally murdered in broad daylight.
Yes.
And I think I think as Black Republicans or Black conservatives, we've got to call a spade a spade. And the other part of that is we've got to start talking about issues like prison reform. I've got my challenges with 45, but one thing I've got to give him credit for is this president has taken to task, whether it was political or not. He's been very big on reforming prison reform and really, creating an atmosphere that talks about giving people second chances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as Black people, we've got to be savvy enough to pick out the things that help our folks and to also call out the things that harm our folks. All this is a business to me. And I think we've got to treat politics as a business to the point where if we are ill-served, we got to call it out. Doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican or independent. It's really important that Black people own their issues and then offer solutions to fix it.
Exactly. And you talked a lot about like prison reform, and in some ways, doesn't criminal justice reform also start at lower levels where, we as a society have to be, more accountable to, just how we can really advocate for each other. And what is, we don't have a panacea right now, but we're looking for solutions on how that can continue to happen and how we can advocate for just better standards for ourselves. And you mentioned just things have to start at lower levels and then work their ways up, and in some ways to demand from one group for how another group should be treated isn't necessarily the way. It would have to be like on our part, we would have to, just demand more from ourselves, and then also demand more from the lower levels of, just how policy is created, and just being a little bit more participatory in how things are shaped on local levels. What's your input on that?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to look at is literacy. And so I want to give kudos to those Detroit kids who took it upon themselves to go to the governor and demand the right to an education. Unfortunately, it took kids to do something that bureaucrats and adults couldn't do. And so I want to give them full credit is that the first thing we've got to talk about is literacy. The second thing we've got to talk about is not only just an education, but how do we prepare for a global education? How do we start looking at the fact that we're no longer competing with the guy down the street, we're competing with the guy across the globe.
Exactly.
And then the third thing I think we've got to do is we've got to start preparing our people for the future. And so whether that means demanding better quality schools, I am a big ed reformer, and so I believe that if a school is ill-serving a kid, it needs to be shut down immediately. Our kids don't have time to wait for bureaucrats to get it right. But the other part of that is we've got to be realistic in saying that the reality is all our kids aren't going to college, and that's okay. So how do we begin to prepare them for skilled trade jobs? How do we begin to prepare them for some of the jobs that unfortunately, due to COVID and due to the baby boom generation, we've got shortages in things like EMS workers, things like police officers, things like skilled trade workers, things like EMS and health and tech. How do we bring in and prepare the next wave of our workforce, starting not just at high school, but even as early as middle school? And so I think that, as African Americans, whether you're Black, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think the conversation of education shouldn't be bipartisan or shouldn't be partisan. I think it needs to be a bipartisan conversation of how do we fix education, because in the end, a child is either getting educated or they're not. And I think we've got to have the steadfast to know that an educated society is not only a safer society, but it's a better society.
Exactly. And it's one that can really champion for everyone. Each one teach one, everyone is lifted up. And if, one person is doing well, then they, continue to uplift everyone else. And then the society as a whole is uplifted. You did bring up a generational issue, with baby boomers kind of being phased out of the workforce and retiring. And now we're kind of looking at millennials are beginning to run for office, and we're a different breed. We're outspoken and we're willing to collaborate for the sake of, shared and mostly liberal ideals like a universal basic income and universal health care. We're more willing to work together than other generations. So how can we stop playing politics as Michiganders and come together when it comes to not only flattening the curve, but like, reopening the country? And how do you think millennials will be instrumental in reshaping that in the future? Because, I started this Quick to Politic back because it was something that I wanted to do a while ago, but I think living during the COVID pandemic is kind of changing how we talk about policy and remaking the economy. So what part, one, do you see millennials playing in that? Because we're a different type of generation, and how can we bridge the divide, you being a conservative, me being a liberal, but us both being millennials? How can we really, how do you see that that's going to impact us in a different way as far as getting things done? Or will it?
I think the most popular and most important thing and the most important word here is compromise. I think that millennials, first of all, I give kudos to millennials because these are some of the most smartest, most intriguing generation of people because they're asking questions. And they're saying that if something doesn't make sense, unlike my grandfather, I'm not going to go along to get along. I think, unfortunately, that has been the bane of politics, is that it's all about self-preservation and making sure that the party is what takes precedence. But I think this generation is focusing on making sure that people are the ones that are first priority. And so I said this actually in a post not too long ago, is that, in my opinion, right now we have two older white males running for the highest office in the land. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But the reality is, one thing I don't see in politics is the mentorship. I don't see the 70-year-old politicians who have been in Washington for 30, 40, 50 years reaching back. And especially when it comes to the African-American community, I think it's very important that those seasoned politicians reach back and mentor and prepare the next generation of politicians like yourself to take those seats. We're not here to stay. And so the reality is we have to look at, as the world changes, issues are going to change. Technology discrimination is going to be very key. And that's something that literally our grandparents didn't have to worry about. Facial recognition. And I've written on this when you start talking about the dangers of mass surveillance, especially on people of color. That's a new generational issue. And so I think that young people and older seasoned people, there has to be a compromise. But on the flip side of that, I'm intrigued by the next generation because they're at least challenging systems. I don't agree with everything AOC says at all, but I admire her tenacity to take it and ask the questions that bureaucrats have refused to ask in the past.
Thank you. I really do feel like it is a change, and we are seeing a little bit more of, we use technology to our advantage. We get ideas, and we are able to mobilize in ways using social media and just technology to work together and to see that it's not necessarily about having information siloed, which I think maybe baby boomers and even Gen Xers to a degree will, kind of, okay, well, I worked hard for this and this is what we're doing and we're going to stay the course with the old way. I think it's up to us to usher in a new way and to, then to cultivate the spirit of we're all in this together. So Thank you for that. And I just want to shift gears here for a moment and kind of talk about entrepreneurship. You're a huge advocate for financial literacy, and you operate with an entrepreneurial spirit. Um, what are some of the challenges? There are a lot of challenges that face entrepreneurs today, and you know, what would be some recommendations for how to pivot, and what advice would you give to others on being nimble when faced with adversity and when your back is against the wall? Like, how can you begin to envision different ways of interacting with the economy, given that we're living in a different age with this pandemic?
Well, I think the first thing is we've got to look at, for young entrepreneurs, the biggest issue for minority is capital. And so I think that it's very important that those individuals who have made it, that they take risks on those who have not, and specifically with people who look like them. The other thing is that I think one of the conversations politically that the next generation has to focus on is less about social justice. It's always been the social justice conversation. The economic justice conversation, especially post-COVID, is going to be incredibly important, because the reality is we saw New York Times stated there are over 100,000 companies that literally are not coming back. And so if you figure 100,000 companies, even if a company has at least 5 people minimum, think about how many people that is that are now out of work. And so the conversation has to be about economic empowerment, access to capital, and then making sure that minority subcontract agreements are more important now than they've ever been before in this nation.
So you talked about access to capital. Now, even before the pandemic, there was an issue where, entrepreneurs of color in particular weren't always, on the receiving end of investment from venture capitalist firms. And, even knowing where to begin, it's entrepreneurs of color and women entrepreneurs are typically seen as a underestimated entrepreneur group. And so what would be your comments on how, getting access to capital and, not so much focusing on being a social justice warrior, but which is typically where some entrepreneurs of color and, people who are change makers, I should say, innovators and disruptors who are trying to make changes typically start on the social side of things, because there hasn't been historically a lot of justice when it comes to financial and economic empowerment. So people are starting in those realms, but you're saying, it would pay more attention to one side, but it's been harder. So how do you overcome those hurdles with regard to getting businesses that are represented by minorities, to feel empowered and to feel like they can even start? Because in some ways, women and minorities don't start because of these hurdles, where if you're a venture capitalist, you're not going to pay attention to someone's business if they're in that category.
Well, I think, and I'm going to say something a little controversial, but I think if we're going to solve the problem, we need to solve the problem. When you hear the term minority women business enterprises, the women part is the challenge, because white women are still considered in these contracts. Now, why is that important? If you have MBEs, minority business enterprises, minority women are still considered for those opportunities. And so when you talk about the level of who's actually getting the contracts, that's very important, and that's a policy question, because now you're talking about if under minority business enterprises are minority women, African American, Hispanic, minority in America, are they still considered for those type of contracts? And so the language becomes very important. The other part is that when we talk about what does minority investment look like? It looks like capital. And so one of our biggest hurdles is the bonding issue for a lot of small business owners, is that you may be able to do the work, but the reality is if you're not bonded up to a certain point, no one's going to take a chance on your business. And so we've got to start to look at how do we hold organizations like the Urban League and like the Black Chambers, and like some of the small minority business enterprise nonprofits, those are the people that, along with elected officials like yourself, they've got to go to Lansing and say, we've got to create real opportunities for people to be able to start a business. Because the reality is that in America, or right now, if you don't have the capital or if you don't have the bonding, it's very difficult for you to even get going. And then now, and we haven't even talked about the credit issue. And so that's another issue. And so there's so many barriers to starting a business that it should be very simple. If you've got a clientele and a person is willing to invest in you, you should be able to start a business without all the red tape.
I'm glad you touched on two things that are actually some of my leading questions, but then I kind of wanted to expand on this personal responsibility and, just being a little bit more fiscally responsible. One side of the conservative argument that my guest last week was also a Republican congressional candidate running against Alyssa Slotkin. And this was something that we kind of differed on, this approach of bootstrapping, and that, you have to take personal responsibility. Of course you do, but in some ways a conservative argument is, if you are in a situation where you're in poverty and, you are facing hurdles, it's because you haven't worked hard enough, you haven't put yourself up by your bootstraps, and, you are somehow, deficient, and you're somehow at fault for, maybe some systemic issues that, in a lot of ways are historical and they need dismantling. And this is not just for race, it's more socioeconomic, because people living in poverty in a lot of ways have, these barriers that society kind of hasn't looked at in depth on how to dismantle. And so, like, what do you say to that argument, that on one side, you have, a group that has been historically marginalized, and then on the other side, with you being a conservative, it's, you really have to bootstrap, you have to, overcome insurmountable barriers and, deal with it with grace and tenacity and skill. So how do you keep that balance?
Well, I think this is another conversation of why it's important for Black Republicans to create the narrative. The reality is America's a business and life isn't fair. And so I always am opposed to people saying, you need to pick your own self up by your bootstraps, because the reality is everybody has been picked up by somebody else. That's the way the world works. Now, the challenge is our conversation has got to start to the root of the issue. And so issues like education reform become important, because when you talk about why people are not getting opportunities, well, it starts with the fact that we've got an underskilled and undervalued community. And the reality is, if you've got an underskilled community, many of these folks don't have a chance right out of middle school. And so it's important for us to start early to talk about education reform, to talk about early childhood development and how it affects Black kids versus white kids. It's important to start to talk about issues around, are we preparing a curriculum that's 40 years too late? And are we really making technology a part of our curriculums in our public schools? Those are the things that will demyth that myth of, well, people aren't picking themselves up by the bootstrap, because I think that's where Black Republicans can talk about issues like prison reform, like education reform, like civil rights, to start to talk about how do we start to prepare mothers who, I'm pro-life, but the reality is, when we get into the pro-life, pro-choice argument, I don't want bureaucrats in that decision that a mother has to make. I think that, in my personal opinion, I think those are decisions that have to be made between that woman, her faith leader, and her doctor, not someone out of Lansing or out of Washington. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we've got to start to tackle some very serious issues that affect our community and offer real solutions for them, not just do sound bites. Unfortunately, it sounds like there's been a lot of sound bites, but not a lot of solutions.
which is why it's really important to push for a united message around education reform and prison reform, particularly with the education reform piece. Education is the great equalizer, and that is in a lot of ways, how you can, begin to put yourself in a whole different mindset. And when you can, enrich yourself through education, then you'll know the other steps that come with that, which also lead to financial empowerment. And if you are improving your skill sets and personal development, professional development, you're expanding your networks, and then your network becomes your net worth. And so it kind of leads to a lot of different things. And I think we just have to, as a society, be consistent with really pushing for more broadly sweeping education reform. I'm actually going to switch gears completely. And you are a huge advocate for financial literacy. And so what advice would you give for folks who during this pandemic are looking for ways to invest? What stocks or investment funds would you say to invest in, or how should we be spending our money? What are some smart financial moves to make? And is it safe to invest in index funds versus individual stocks, or municipal bonds? Is this a good move to go? What advice would you give to folks out there?
Well, the first thing is, I think we need to save in this economy. I always tell people, now is not the time to go to South Beach. Now is the time to put a little back, kind of the way that our grandparents used to operate. I think the good thing about COVID is that I think it's bringing families together. And so I think things that are priorities, like starting to prepare for college, starting to put a little back just to have, a safe allocation of money, starting to, invest in personal care, things like clothes, things like professional outfits, things like, and so I want to say the first part of, kind of my thoughts on what should we be doing with our money is really coming down to self-preservation and self-care. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we've got to start looking at, if we want to talk about investments, we don't have to invest in the stock markets or invest in Wall Street. I think we can start investing in our own neighborhoods. The bad thing is we've got over 100,000 jobs that are not coming back. And we've got over 36 million people out of work. And so I'm an optimist when I say there's an opportunity there. Now is the question of how do we get 10 people together to open up a business that is what they would call essential. And so things like dry cleaners, you got to have them in a community. Things like, things that are essential, anything in the healthcare industry right now. Assisted living facilities are something that I think we can start. Real estate has always been kind of a safe thing to invest in. And it doesn't take a lot of money to do it. And I think that we've got to start kind of coming back to basics when we talk about financial literacy, things like, college funds and investing in what I call the bread, the guns and butter, the things that appreciate versus the things that don't appreciate. Those are the conversations that I think right now we need to have. I think the stock market is fine, but I think until we get a grip on COVID-19, we really should keep it local in terms of how our dollars are spent.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you. That sounds like very sound advice. And saving is always a good way to make sure that you're in a good place, and keeping track of your money and not mindlessly spending. And I think that's kind of going to reshape the way we invest our money, the way we participate in supporting small businesses, local, shopping local. And I think it'll also just make us more mindful of what's really essential, what's really needed. And so you also talked about like opening up the economy, and I'm just gonna, this is gonna be our last question. I really want to know, in your estimation, what is reopening going to look like, and what is gonna be the legacy of how we reshape normal? What will the new normal be? in a post-COVID economy. And you talked about the death of a lot of small businesses and a lot of industries that are just going to try change drastically. What is, the vision? What do you think is going to happen for, how the economy reopens, how we are going to be as a society economically in the next 6 to 12 months?
So this concept of the new normal is always interesting to me because as a Black man, Black people in Metro Detroit never had the normal. When you talk about the fact that we've got water shortages, where people didn't have something as simple as running water. Small businesses were always struggling in places like Detroit, the East Side, Hamtramck, Highland Park, Inkster, Romulus, River Rouge. And so I think what COVID has done is it's exposed the issues that we always knew were there but never discussed. And so I think the first thing is what COVID is going to do is it's exposing the things that we tried to hide, whether we talk about less of access to water, or businesses that were failing, or the fact that people didn't have sufficient health care. It's putting the bright eye and also on leadership, and in cases failed leadership. It's shining a bright light on the issues. Now it's up to us to either change it or keep it the status quo. And so I think, I'm hoping that, the governor's stay-at-home order is going to be released at the end of this month. I'm hoping that, social distancing is something that I think will continue. I think that we are now in a state where there are a couple things that we need to monitor. And part of that is we need to start to get wise on the focuses of mass surveillance. It is not, and my fear is that mass surveillance is not going to treat our people fairly or responsibly. And because the reality is, when you look at who's actually creating the databases and the user interfaces, it's not us. So all off the back, there's an inherent bias of the people who are actually creating the databases to do this type of technology, which goes back to why it's so important for our young people to be learning and engaged in this tech workforce. That is the job market of the future. And if we are not talking about things like coding and IT technology and user interface and UX, if kids aren't learning that now, we've got some troubles in the future.
We're going to be behind if kids are not, and that's something that I've even pressed in my community, where our school system, there isn't an emphasis on coding and STEM technology, and it's just, you're going to be left behind in the digital divide if you are focusing on something that's a little bit more behind the curve, like graphic design. That's it goes hand in hand, but you've got to learn all of the other components of that too. And so I think that's really important. But I feel like I almost want to chime in and say something a little controversial here about the facial recognition program in the city of Detroit in particular. I think you are right, because the programming and who's putting together the monitoring software, of course, that demographic might not be who represents the city of Detroit. City of Detroit is 80% Black, and but the police force who are monitoring what goes on with that, I think is it's overwhelmingly going to be, okay, well, you look like us, and so therefore you're going to have a little bit more of, there's less of a chance for discrimination. And I do feel like, though, there are problems with just being surveilled and being watched all the time. But in some ways, it's like, if you're being watched and you have nothing to hide, then what do you have to fear? But that's, of course, controversial. I've said that to other people, and that's a unpopular opinion that I hold, and we're going to agree to disagree on that one. But I think
let me add this to it. I agree with you, but I think it's much deeper, because I think for millennials like yourself, Um, the name of the game in politics, whether you are a state official or a federal official or a city official, is now going to get into the conversation of privacy rights. Should you be monitored everywhere you go? Should what you search on the internet be monitored every time you look something up? So the whole concept of a free market or a free society, I think for your generation and my generation, is going to be a very big issue, because as we see, one thing COVID, and I actually posted this on Facebook, one challenge I think COVID had is that I don't think the virus was the hoax, but I think what is questionable is how we interact with one another now. I think that sense of community is being challenged now.
And do you see that, like, people on the right, I know, like, my guest, Mike Dittmer, led this protest in Lansing. Do you feel that in some ways rights are being infringed and you do have a right to protest in Lansing? Or what is your take on that? Like, how much is too much and how far is too far?
Well, I think common sense has to be at the core here. If we're talking about keeping people safe from a virus that is spreading, then obviously it's the governor's job to protect the state and protect the constituents. However, I think data is the number one important thing here, because if we're talking about shutting down businesses when we have alternative options like face masks, gloves, I think we really have to make data the driver and not personal policy decisions. And I think that's a challenge here. I mean, right now, we can be, how do we put creativity back in the government? And so we may not allow sit downs during a pandemic, but people can still protected can still pick up takeout orders, which keeps the restaurant going. It keeps the economy going. Barbers, can still wear gloves and masks like some of them already do. And people can still feel the need to get their haircut or go to a beauty salon. And so I think we really have to start to get smart and use creativity around, what are alternative ways that we can keep business going, to keep the economy going, which is just as important as people's lives, but also do it in a safe manner to keep people protected. And so, I think people have a right to protest. That's a part of their American right. But there has to be, from our leadership, there has to be a conversation about how do we use common sense when we're dealing with a crisis.
Well said, well said. So I definitely, I hear you on that part where you do have a right. Is it the right that you want to exercise at that moment? That remains to be seen, and I think it's a matter of opinion as well. So yeah. Thank you very much for your insight on just the way that the direction we'll take as an economy, and just all of the financial advice. Any other closing words on remaking this new normal and the future of how policy will shape that?
I think every American now has to question how much security and protection are they willing to give up in the name of losing their freedoms. And I think this is a very important topic for anyone that's seeking public office, because I think we want to be safe, but the reality is what makes America great is not just our system of government, it's our freedoms. And so I think the rights to privacy has to be protected at all costs. That's how you keep your families free, and that's how we keep America that beam of shining light for everyone around the world who wants to make it here.
Awesome. Thank you. This was a really good conversation, and I feel like it sparked another question I was trying to think of, but then it slipped my mind. It was talking about, young folks and, millennials just kind of giving up freedoms because we're so attached to social media. We are very voyeuristic. We want to see what other people are doing. We want to display everything that we're doing. So I think in some ways we're already giving up things, but in other ways we're such social justice warriors that we want to, advocate and say, like, no, we don't want to have this much, but you're already giving it up. You're already giving it up because of technology. And thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for being a part of this conversation. That's a larger part of the series on, what will it take to remake the new normal? Because everybody talks about how will we go back to normal once restrictions are lifted, once there is a vaccine that's found, and the normal we had before was a flawed system, and we want to reshape how we begin to even put all the pieces back together, and how we can seamlessly transition a new way of doing things into what we go back to. So thank you very much for coming on the show, and
Thank
I
you.
was excited to have you on, and hopefully on Facebook, I wasn't able to check, but hopefully we got a few questions and we can answer those offline. Thank you to my audience for joining out there. And thank you for those of you who joined on Instagram. And I look forward to having another conversation.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop now.